Hello and welcome to Marple's Mind, where every story feels like a conversation. Over a warm cup of coffee today, I bring you a brand new Miss Marple mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in. From now, let's get started. Chapter 1. The Peculiar Invitation. The Morning Post arrived at precisely 8:30, as it had done every day for the past 40 years, in the village of St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favourite chintz armchair by the window, set down her knitting needles and adjusted her spectacles, as her maid Cherry brought in the small silver tray bearing the day's correspondence. "Rather more than usual today, Miss Marple," Cherry observed cheerfully, placing the tray on the small mahogany side table. Miss Marple's keen blue eyes surveyed the collection. Bills, a letter from her nephew Raymond, a circular from the church committee, and one envelope that stood out distinctly from the rest. It was of expensive cream-coloured paper, bearing an elaborate wax seal pressed with what appeared to be a coat of arms featuring intertwined staircases. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, carefully breaking the seal with her letter opener. The handwriting inside was elegant, but showed signs of agitation in its slightly uneven strokes. "Thornfield Manor, Little Weybray, Somerset, 15th September. My dear Jane, I do hope this letter finds you in good health. You may be surprised to hear from me after all these years. We last met at dear cousin Mabel's funeral, if memory serves. Time does fly, doesn't it? I write to you now with a rather unusual request. I find myself in need of someone with your particular talents. Yes, I have heard of your remarkable ability to see through the fog of human deception to the truth beneath. There are strange happenings at Thornfield Manor that require a perceptive mind, and I can think of no one better suited than yourself. The manor, as you may have heard, is rather unique in its architecture. My late husband's grandfather was quite eccentric and insisted on incorporating 13 different staircases into the design. Each has its own character, its own purpose, and lately, it seems, its own mysteries. I'm hosting a small gathering this weekend, a few old friends and some new acquaintances. Nothing formal, you understand, but I would be deeply grateful if you could join us. I fear I cannot put my concerns into writing, but I assure you, your presence would be most welcome, and, I believe, necessary. A car will be sent for you on Friday at 2:00 should you accept. Please do say yes, Jane. I have a feeling that something dreadful is about to happen, and I don't know who else to turn to. Your old friend, Beatrice Thornfield, P.S. Do bring your knitting. I remember you were never without it. And I find the click of needles so soothing to the nerves." Miss Marple read the letter twice, her expression growing more thoughtful with each perusal. Cherry, who had been dusting the mantelpiece with rather less efficiency than usual, finally gave in to curiosity. "Not bad news, I hope, Miss Marple." "No, Cherry, not bad news exactly. Rather intriguing news." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "Tell me, have you ever heard of Thornfield Manor?" Cherry's eyes widened. "Oh, yes, miss. My cousin's boy works in Little Weybray. He says it's the queerest house in all of Somerset. 13 staircases. Imagine the work of keeping them all clean. They say the old man who built it was mad as a hatter. Begging your pardon, miss." "No need to apologize, Cherry. Eccentricity and madness are often confused, though they're quite different things." Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her fingers automatically finding the rhythm while her mind worked. 13 staircases, such a specific number. Not 12, not 14, but 13. Unlucky, some would say, Cherry ventured. Perhaps, or perhaps there was method in the madness. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Cherry, I believe I shall need my small travelling case packed. The grey wool dress, I think, and my comfortable shoes. One can never investigate properly in uncomfortable shoes. You're going then, miss? Oh, yes, I rather think I am. When an old friend writes of strange happenings and fears something dreadful, one can hardly refuse. Besides, a slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. I've always been curious about architectural oddities. They so often reflect the personalities of those who create them. As Cherry bustled off to prepare for the journey, Miss Marple remained by the window, her hands busy with her knitting, but her mind already at work. 13 staircases, a house full of guests and a hostess afraid of something she couldn't name. It had all the ingredients of a most interesting puzzle. The morning sun caught the peculiar wax seal on the envelope, making the intertwined staircases seem to shift and dance. Miss Marple studied it more closely and noticed something she'd missed before. At the centre of the design was a tiny figure, seemingly falling. Most curious indeed, she murmured, and continued her knitting, already anticipating what mysteries awaited her at the house with 13 staircases. Chapter 2. The House of Ascending Secrets. The car that arrived for Miss Marple was a gleaming black Bentley, driven by a taciturn chauffeur who seemed disinclined to conversation. This suited Miss Marple perfectly, as it allowed her to observe the changing countryside as they drove deeper into Somerset. The journey took them through winding lanes bordered by ancient hedgerows, past villages that seemed untouched by time, until finally they turned through a pair of imposing iron gates. "Thornfield Manor, madam," the chauffeur announced, his first words in 2 hours. Miss Marple's initial view of the house took her breath away, not from its beauty, though it was handsome enough in its way, but from its sheer peculiarity. The manor seemed to have been designed by someone with a passion for vertical architecture. Towers and turrets sprouted at odd angles, connected by what appeared to be external staircases spiralling around the building like ivy. Windows appeared at irregular intervals, some tall and Gothic, others round like portholes, giving the structure an almost whimsical appearance despite its grey stone solidity. "Extraordinary," Miss Marple murmured. Lady Beatrice Thornfield was waiting on the front steps, or rather, on one of 3 sets of front steps, Miss Marple noticed. Her old friend had aged considerably since their last meeting, her once auburn hair now silver, her face lined with what appeared to be recent worry. "Jane, how wonderful that you've come." Beatrice embraced her warmly, though Miss Marple could feel the tension in her shoulders. "I do hope the journey wasn't too tiring." "Not at all, my dear. Your home is quite remarkable." Beatrice's laugh had a brittle edge. "That's one word for it. My late husband's grandfather, Sir Mortimer Thornfield, designed it himself. He was obsessed with what he called a vertical living. Come, let me show you to your room, and I'll explain the layout. It takes some getting used to." As they entered the main hall, Miss Marple understood immediately what Beatrice meant. Instead of one grand staircase, she could see entrances to at least 4 different staircases from where she stood. One swept upward in an elegant curve to the left, another climbed straight and narrow to the right. A third seemed to spiral behind a column, and a fourth, barely visible, appeared to descend rather than ascend. The main staircase, Beatrice indicated the curved one, leads to the principal bedrooms and the gallery. The straight staircase goes to the tower rooms. The spiral serves the east wing, and that one," she pointed to the descending stairs, "goes to the wine cellars and the old kitchens, though we use the modern ones now." "And that makes 4, Miss Marple observed. "Where are the other 9? "Scattered throughout the house. Some are hidden, servant stairs behind panels. Others are purely decorative, or so we think. One is external, climbing the north tower. Another is in the library, built into the bookshelves. It's quite maddening, really. Guests are constantly getting lost." As if to illustrate this point, a young woman appeared at the top of the curved staircase, looking flustered. "Lady Thornfield, I'm terribly sorry, but I can't seem to find my way back to the Blue Room." "You've taken the wrong staircase again, Miss Ashford. You need the spiral staircase for the east wing." Beatrice sighed. "This is Miss Marple, an old friend. Jane, this is Cynthia Ashford, one of our guests." Miss Ashford was pretty in a nervous sort of way, with pale blonde hair and darting eyes. She descended to greet Miss Marple, but her attention seemed elsewhere. "Pleased to meet you, Lady Thornfield, about what we discussed earlier." "Later, my dear," Beatrice cut her off firmly. "Let me get Miss Marple settled first." As they climbed the main staircase, Miss Marple noticed several other guests. A distinguished-looking man with silver temples stood in the gallery, studying a portrait. A younger man in tweeds emerged from what appeared to be a hidden door, looking startled to find anyone there. From somewhere above came the sound of footsteps, though it was impossible to tell which staircase they were on. "How many guests are staying?" Miss Marple inquired. "7, including yourself. My nephew Charles, Mr. Ashford, and his daughter Cynthia, whom you just met. Dr. Pemberton, that's him in the gallery. Mrs. Weatherby, a widow from London, and Mr. James Crane, a business associate of my late husband." Beatrice paused at a landing. "Your room is just here, the Rose Room. It has a lovely view of the garden." The room was indeed charming, with rose-patterned wallpaper and windows overlooking an elaborate garden where Miss Marple could see yet another staircase, stone steps winding through the terraces. "Beatrice," Miss Marple said gently, setting down her travelling case, "what is really troubling you?" Her friend's composure finally cracked. "Oh, Jane, it's hard to explain. Things have been wrong since we opened the house to guests. Items moved, strange noises at night, always on the staircases. And there's something about the 13th staircase." She was interrupted by a tremendous crash from somewhere in the house, followed by a scream. "Oh, God!" Beatrice whispered, her face draining of colour. "It started!" They rushed from the room, but immediately faced a dilemma: which staircase to take? The scream seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the unusual architecture in a way that made its origin impossible to determine. "This way," Beatrice decided, leading them down the spiral staircase. But as they descended, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that they were going in entirely the wrong direction, and that somewhere in this maze of ascending and descending passages, something terrible was unfolding. The house with 13 staircases, it seemed, was designed to confuse, and perhaps that had been the point all along. Chapter 3. The 13th Step. The source of the scream proved to be Mrs. Weatherby, a plump woman in her 60s, who had apparently knocked over a suit of armour in the entrance hall. By the time Miss Marple and Beatrice arrived, having taken 2 wrong staircases, several other guests had gathered, all having arrived by different routes. "I'm terribly sorry," Mrs. Weatherby gasped, fanning herself with a handkerchief. "It moved! I swear the wretched thing moved as I walked past." "Nonsense," declared Mr. Ashford, a stern-looking man with a military bearing. You must have brushed against it." Dr. Pemberton, the distinguished gentleman from the gallery, was helping the butler, Stevens, right the armour. "No harm done," he said soothingly. "These old houses can play tricks on one's nerves." Miss Marple noticed that the younger man in tweeds, who must be James Crane, was watching from the curved staircase with an expression of barely concealed amusement. Charles Thornfield, Beatrice's nephew, emerged from yet another doorway looking irritated. "Really, Aunt Beatrice, this house is impossible. I've just spent 20 minutes trying to find my way from the library to my room." "Perhaps," Beatrice said with forced brightness, "this would be a good time to give everyone a proper tour. Stevens, would you lead the way?" The butler, a tall, cadaverous man who seemed perfectly suited to the Gothic atmosphere, nodded gravely. "If you would all follow me, I shall endeavour to explain the layout of Thornfield Manor." What followed was perhaps the most peculiar house tour Miss Marple had ever experienced. Stevens led them through a bewildering succession of rooms, passages, and, of course, staircases. There was the library staircase, cunningly built into the bookshelves so that one climbed past leather-bound volumes to reach a private study. The servants' stair, hidden behind a panel in the dining room. The tower stair that corkscrewed up the exterior of the building, offering dizzying views. Sir Mortimer believed, Stevens explained in his sepulchral voice, that each staircase should serve not merely a functional but a philosophical purpose. The straight stair represents the direct path of virtue. The spiral suggests the circuitous route of contemplation. The hidden stairs remind us that not all journeys are meant to be seen. "Pretentious rubbish," muttered Mr. Ashford. "And the 13th staircase?" Miss Marple inquired innocently. A hush fell over the group. Stevens's expression, already sombre, became positively funereal. "Perhaps, madam, we should continue to the drawing-room." "Oh, come now, Stevens," Charles Thornfield said impatiently. "You can't leave us in suspense. Where is this mysterious 13th staircase?" Stevens glanced at Lady Thornfield, who nodded reluctantly. "Very well. If you will follow me." He led them to a part of the house that felt older, darker. The corridors were narrower here, the ceilings lower. Finally, they stopped before what appeared to be a blank wall, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed the outline of a door, painted over many times. "Behind this sealed door," Stevens intoned, "lies the 13th staircase. It has been closed since 1895. "Why?" Cynthia Ashford asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was an incident. Sir Mortimer's son, Mr. Cornelius Thornfield, died on that staircase. The circumstances were unusual. He means suspicious," Charles said bluntly. "Family legend says he was pushed, though nothing was ever proved." "The staircase was sealed by Sir Mortimer's orders," Stevens continued. "He declared that when 12 staircases could not prevent tragedy, a 13th could only invite it." Miss Marple stepped closer to the sealed door, noting fresh scratches in the paint near the floor. "Someone has been trying to open it," she observed. Everyone pressed forward to look. The scratches were indeed new, the wood beneath showing pale against the aged paint. "Probably mice," Dr. Pemberton suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Rather large mice," Miss Marple murmured, "with something sharp." That evening at dinner, the 13th staircase dominated the conversation despite Beatrice's attempts to steer towards safer topics. The dining room, reached by 3 different staircases, depending on where one started, seemed to encourage secrets. The candlelight threw strange shadows, and every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps on distant stairs. "I researched your grandfather before coming," James Crane announced suddenly. He was younger than Miss Marple had first thought, perhaps 30, with sharp features and clever eyes. He was quite the inventor, wasn't he? Made a fortune in architectural innovations. What sort of innovations? Miss Marple asked. Mechanical devices, mainly. Lifting mechanisms, rotating rooms, that sort of thing, I wonder. He looked speculatively around the dining room. How much of this house is exactly what it seems? Are you suggesting there are secret mechanisms? Mrs. Weatherby asked nervously. Why not? A man who builds 13 staircases might build other things too. At precisely midnight, Miss Marple was awakened by a sound that made her sit bolt upright. It was the unmistakable creak of footsteps on stairs, but not just any footsteps. These had an odd, hollow quality, as if they came from somewhere far away or long ago. She rose, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and quietly opened her door. The corridor was dark, lit only by moonlight from a tall window. The footsteps continued, seeming to come from the direction of the sealed door. Moving carefully, Miss Marple made her way through the confusing passages, grateful for her excellent memory. As she approached the sealed door, she saw she was not alone. A figure stood before it, pressing an ear against the painted wood. "Hearing things, Mr. Crane?" she asked softly. He spun around, startled. "Miss Marple! Yes, listen." She moved closer and heard it clearly now. Footsteps ascending, the 13th step creaking distinctively, then silence. Then the pattern repeated. "It's been going on for 10 minutes, Crane whispered, always stopping at the 13th step. The step where Cornelius died? So the legend says." His eyes glittered in the darkness. "Miss Marple, I think someone is trying to tell us something, or warn us, or frighten us," Miss Marple suggested. "The question is, why?" As if in answer, the footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, they heard something else. A grinding, mechanical sound from behind the sealed door, like ancient gears beginning to turn. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "we should return to our rooms and lock our doors. Whatever game is being played here, it's only just beginning." As they retreated, neither noticed the fresh paint dust on the floor, nor the fact that the scratches near the bottom of the door had grown longer, as if something or someone was slowly but persistently working to break free. Chapter 4. Blood on the Marble Landing. The morning dawned grey and misty, fitting weather for what was to come. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and made her way to the breakfast room via what she hoped was the most direct route. She found only Dr. Pemberton there, studying a medical journal over his coffee. "Ah, Miss Marple, I trust you slept well despite our midnight disturbances." "You heard them too." Miss Marple poured herself tea from the silver pot. "My dear lady, I suspect the entire house heard them. These old buildings carry sound in the most peculiar ways." He set down his journal, though I must say, the acoustic properties here are unlike anything I've encountered, almost as if they were designed that way. Before Miss Marple could respond, Cynthia Ashford burst through the door, her face pale with excitement. "Has anyone seen Lord Thornfield this morning?" "Lord Thornfield?" Miss Marple was puzzled. "But I thought—" "Oh, I mean Charles," Cynthia said breathlessly. "He inherited the title when his uncle died last year. He doesn't use it much, but, it doesn't matter. He's missing." "Missing?" Dr. Pemberton frowned. "What do you mean?" "His bed hasn't been slept in. I know because I went to speak with him about something important, and his room was empty." Miss Marple and Dr. Pemberton exchanged glances. It was barely 7 o'clock, rather early for social calls. "Perhaps he rose early for a walk," Dr. Pemberton suggested, "in this fog and without telling anyone." Cynthia wrung her hands. after last night's strange noises, I'm worried something's happened." They were interrupted by Stevens, who appeared in the doorway looking even more cadaverous than usual. "I beg your pardon, but has anyone seen his lordship? He requested an early morning call, but his room is empty." A search was quickly organised. The house's labyrinthine nature made this a complex undertaking, with searchers constantly encountering each other on different staircases, having covered the same ground by different routes. Lady Beatrice, roused from her room, coordinated the effort with increasing anxiety. "Charles is many things," she said, "but he's punctual to a fault. He wouldn't simply vanish without word." It was James Crane who made the discovery. His shout echoed through the house, bringing everyone running, or rather bringing everyone eventually, after negotiating the maze of passages. He stood at the top of the grand marble staircase, the one that curved elegantly from the entrance hall to the first-floor gallery. "Don't come any closer," he warned, his face grim. "Someone fetch Dr. Pemberton." But it was too late for medical assistance. At the bottom of the marble stairs lay Charles Thornfield, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, a dark pool of blood spreading from beneath his head. His eyes stared sightlessly at the painted ceiling, where cherubs frolicked among clouds, oblivious to the tragedy below. "Nobody touch anything," Miss Marple said firmly, making her way carefully down the stairs. "Mr. Crane, would you be so good as to telephone for the police?" "Already done," Stevens announced. "I took the liberty when his lordship couldn't be found." Dr. Pemberton, arriving via a different staircase, hurried to examine the body. After a few moments he looked up gravely. "He's been dead for several hours, since perhaps 2 or 3 this morning." "But we heard the footsteps at midnight," Mrs. Weatherby protested. "Surely he can't have been lying here all that time." "The footsteps were on the 13th staircase," Miss Marple reminded her. "This is the main staircase." Lady Beatrice swayed, and Mr. Ashford caught her arm. "This is terrible," she whispered. "First his uncle's heart attack last year, and now Charles." "He fell?" Cynthia asked tremulously. "It was an accident?" Miss Marple was examining the scene with sharp eyes, noting details. The position of the body, the pattern of blood, the scattered objects near the base of the stairs. Charles's pocket watch, broken at 2:47, a button that appeared to have been torn from clothing, and curiously, a small piece of what looked like old parchment. "See here," Dr. Pemberton said suddenly. "There's a wound on the back of his head that doesn't match the fall. It's too localized, too deep." "You mean?" Mr. Ashford began. "I mean Lord Thornfield was struck before he fell. This was no accident." A shocked silence greeted this pronouncement. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had climbed halfway back up the stairs and was examining the banister. "Most interesting," she murmured. "There are fresh scratches here on the marble and— Yes, what's this?" Caught on the ornate ironwork of the banister was a single thread of unusual colour. Not quite gold, not quite green, with an odd sheen to it. "Nobody is to leave the house," Stevens announced with surprising authority. "The police will want to question everyone." "But who would want to kill Charles?" Lady Beatrice asked desperately. "He could be difficult, yes, but murder?" "Perhaps," James Crane said slowly, "the question isn't who wanted to kill him, but why he was on the stairs at that hour. What brought him down here in the middle of the night?" Miss Marple carefully made her way back down, avoiding the blood. She bent to examine the piece of parchment without touching it. It appeared to be old, very old, with partial writing visible, architectural symbols and what might be measurements. "Mr. Stevens," she asked, "are there any architectural plans of the house? Original blueprints, perhaps?" "Sir Mortimer's plans are kept in the library, madam, though I believe some pages have been missing for years." "Missing," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "How convenient. Tell me, did Lord Thornfield have any particular interest in the house's architecture?" "He was obsessed with it," Cynthia burst out. "Always poking about, measuring, things tapping on walls. He said there were secrets in this house worth a fortune." "Cynthia," her father said sharply. "Well, it's true. He told me he'd found something important. He said once he proved it, everything would change." Miss Marple looked around the assembled group. Fear, shock, and something else, calculation, flickered across various faces. Someone here had murdered Charles Thornfield, striking him down and sending him tumbling down the marble stairs. But why? What had he discovered in this house of vertical mysteries? "I think," she said quietly, "we should all be very careful which staircases we use from now on. It seems one of them has already proven fatal, and in a house with 13 staircases, that leaves 12 more opportunities for tragedy." As if in response to her words, a door slammed somewhere in the house, the sound echoing through the vertical maze like a gunshot. Everyone jumped, and Mrs. Weatherby let out a small scream. The house with 13 staircases had claimed its first victim. Miss Marple had a strong feeling it wouldn't be the last. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Footsteps. Inspector Hartwell arrived within the hour, a competent-looking man in his 40s who seemed unimpressed by the grandeur of Thornfield Manor. He was accompanied by Sergeant Mills, a younger officer who kept staring up at the various staircases with obvious bewilderment. "Right then," Inspector Hartwell said briskly, setting up his headquarters in the morning room. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually, but first I want to establish everyone's whereabouts last night, particularly between midnight and 3 o'clock." What followed was a confusing tangle of testimonies that seemed to contradict each other at every turn. The problem, Miss Marple realized, was the house itself. Its acoustic properties and multiple levels created an almost impossible puzzle of alibis. Lady Beatrice claimed she had been in her room all night, but admitted she'd heard footsteps at various times. "They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere," she said helplessly. "That's the curse of this house. You can never tell where sounds originate." Dr. Pemberton had been reading in the library until well past midnight. "I heard the mysterious footsteps on what I assumed was the 13th staircase. Then later, around 2:30, I heard what sounded like an argument. Voices raised, though I couldn't make out words." "Where did the argument seem to come from?" Inspector Hartwell asked. "That's just it. I couldn't tell. The acoustics here are extraordinary. Sounds bounce and echo in the most peculiar ways." Mr. Ashford claimed to have been asleep by 11, but his daughter Cynthia contradicted him. "Father was restless," she said. "I heard him pacing in his room until at least 1 o'clock. "I was thinking," Mr. Ashford said stiffly, "about business matters." James Crane's account was the most detailed. "I was in my room until the footsteps started at midnight. Then I went to investigate. Miss Marple can confirm this. We met at the sealed door of the 13th staircase. And after that," the inspector prompted, "I returned to my room, but I couldn't sleep. Around 2 o'clock, I heard what sounded like someone running upstairs, but not the main staircase. One of the others, then a crash and silence." Mrs. Weatherby's testimony was the most disturbing. "I heard everything," she declared dramatically. "The footsteps at midnight, yes, but also voices later. A man and a woman arguing. Then footsteps again, someone running. Then that terrible crash. You could distinguish between a man and woman's voices? Inspector Hartwell asked sceptically. Oh, yes, the woman was pleading, the man was angry. Then there was a scream, not the crash, but a scream before it. Miss Marple had been listening carefully to all these accounts. When her turn came, she was precise and methodical. I heard the footsteps at midnight and investigated with Mr. Crane. They appeared to come from behind the sealed door of the 13th staircase. The pattern was distinctive. Someone climbing, stopping at what would be the 13th step, then descending and repeating the process. Could someone actually have been on that staircase? The inspector asked. The door is sealed and painted over many times. However, I noticed fresh scratches near the bottom, suggesting recent attempts to open it. And after midnight? I returned to my room but remained alert. At approximately 2:15, I heard rapid footsteps on what I believe was the spiral staircase in the east wing. Then a door slamming. At 2:47, I checked my watch. I heard the crash that must have been Lord Thornfield's fall. Inspector Hartwell frowned. That's very precise timing, Miss Marple. I have always been a light sleeper, Inspector, and the broken watch found near the body confirms the time. After the interviews, Inspector Hartwell asked Miss Marple to accompany him on an examination of the house. Sergeant Mills remained behind, looking grateful not to navigate the confusing architecture. This place is a nightmare for an investigation, the inspector confided as they climbed the spiral staircase. How can anyone establish an alibi when sounds carry so strangely? That may be precisely the point, Miss Marple suggested. Consider this. If you wanted to commit murder in a house full of witnesses, wouldn't you choose a place where those witnesses couldn't reliably say where sounds came from? They paused on the landing of the spiral staircase. From here, they could see 3 other staircases and hear voices from the morning room below, though the words were indistinct. Remarkable, the inspector murmured. You can hear everything but understand nothing. Exactly. Now, Inspector, I've been thinking about the testimonies. Everyone heard footsteps, but they heard them at different times and from different directions, suggesting multiple people were moving about. Or, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, suggesting someone who knew this house very well was deliberately creating confusion. Consider footsteps at midnight on the 13th staircase, but that staircase is sealed. Footsteps at 2 o'clock on the spiral staircase. Footsteps at 2:15 on what I believe was the servant's stair. And finally, the fatal encounter on the main staircase. You think someone was deliberately moving from staircase to staircase? I think someone was creating a pattern of sounds designed to confuse the timeline and their own location. But they made one crucial error. Which was? Miss Marple smiled slightly. They assumed everyone would be equally confused by the acoustics. But I've spent a lifetime listening to the sounds of villages, Inspector. I know how to distinguish between different types of footsteps, different gaits, different purposes. And what did you hear? I heard one person, Inspector. One person moving systematically through this house, using the staircases like a musical instrument to create a symphony of confusion. But underneath all that deliberate noise, I heard something else. What? The sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they intended to do when they got there. They were interrupted by a shout from below. Sergeant Mills appeared at the bottom of the spiral staircase, looking up at them with excitement. Inspector, you need to see this. We've found something behind the sealed door. As they hurried down, Miss Marple reflected that the house with 13 staircases was beginning to reveal its secrets. But she suspected the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. The vanishing footsteps had told their story to those who knew how to listen. Now it remained to be seen whether the killer realized their carefully orchestrated deception had been heard and understood. Chapter 6. Portraits on the Spiral Stair. The discovery behind the sealed door proved to be both illuminating and puzzling. Sergeant Mills had noticed that the fresh scratches Miss Marple had observed were not attempts to open the door from the outside, but rather marks where something had been pushed through a gap at the bottom, a gap that had been carefully concealed by the multiple layers of paint. "Someone's been passing messages," Inspector Hartwell concluded, examining the thin slit that had been carved into the doorframe, or perhaps retrieving them. Inside the gap, they found several items, fragments of old parchment that matched the piece found near Charles Thornfield's body, a modern pencil stub, and most intriguingly, a small brass key of unusual design. "The key doesn't match any of the standard locks in the house," Stevens confirmed when shown it. "Sir Mortimer was fond of special mechanisms. There are several hidden compartments and secret drawers throughout the manor." This revelation prompted Miss Marple to suggest a more thorough examination of the house's architectural features. If Lord Thornfield discovered something valuable, it's likely hidden in one of these secret compartments. The search began in the library, where the staircase built into the bookshelves had always fascinated visitors. Dr. Pemberton, who had spent considerable time there, offered to guide them. "Charles was particularly interested in this section," he said, indicating a portion of the spiral staircase where the steps were flanked by portraits of the Thornfield family. He spent hours examining these paintings. Miss Marple studied the portraits with keen interest. They depicted various Thornfield ancestors, but she noticed something peculiar about their arrangement. "These portraits have been moved recently," she observed, pointing to faint marks on the wall where frames had previously hung. "How can you tell?" Inspector Hartwell asked. "The wallpaper has faded differently. See these rectangular patches? They're slightly darker, indicating the portraits once hung in different positions." James Crane, who had joined the search, examined the paintings more closely. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a portrait of a stern-looking gentleman in Victorian dress. "The frame is deeper than the others." Indeed, when they lifted the portrait from the wall, they discovered it concealed a small wall safe. The brass key from the sealed door fitted perfectly. Inside the safe were documents that made everyone gasp. Architectural plans, yes, but not just any plans. These were the original blueprints for Thornfield Manor, complete with detailed specifications for hidden mechanisms, secret passages, and most remarkably, a complex system of acoustic chambers designed to carry sound throughout the house in predetermined patterns. "Good heavens," Dr. Pemberton breathed. "Sir Mortimer didn't just build 13 staircases, he built a giant listening device." The plans revealed that the house was honeycombed with hidden passages and acoustic tubes. Sounds from any room could be channeled to specific locations, allowing someone who knew the system to eavesdrop on conversations throughout the manor. "But there's more," Miss Marple said, studying a separate set of documents. "These appear to be modern surveys and valuations. Someone has been assessing the house's worth, not as a residence, but as a collection of architectural innovations." The valuations were staggering. Sir Mortimer's mechanical innovations, if properly documented and preserved, would be worth a fortune to museums and collectors of Victorian engineering. "Charles found this," Cynthia Ashford said suddenly. "That's what he meant when he said he'd discovered something that would change everything." "But why hide it?" Inspector Hartwell asked. "If he'd inherited the house, surely he could do what he liked with it." Lady Beatrice, who had been silent during the search, finally spoke. "Because he hadn't inherited it, not entirely." all eyes turned to her. She looked older, more fragile than when Miss Marple had arrived just 2 days ago. The will, she continued reluctantly, was complicated. Charles inherited the title and the right to live in the house, but the actual ownership was divided. He owned 60%, but the remaining 40% was left to other family members. "Which family members?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Myself, for one. I inherited 20% and—" She hesitated. The remaining 20% went to someone Charles didn't even know existed until recently. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Inspector Hartwell leaned forward. Who? A cousin, the illegitimate son of Charles's great-uncle. He only learned of his inheritance 6 months ago, when the lawyers finally tracked him down. And this cousin's name? Beatrice looked around the room, her eyes settling on James Crane. James Thornfield Crane. He's been using his mother's surname, but he's as much a Thornfield as Charles was. The silence that followed was deafening. James Crane stood perfectly still, his face expressionless, as everyone stared at him. "Is this true?" Inspector Hartwell demanded. Crane nodded slowly. "Yes, though I prefer to think of myself as James Crane. The Thornfield name never did much for my mother." "You didn't think to mention this earlier?" "I didn't think it was relevant to Charles's death. I came here to meet my newfound family and to understand my inheritance. I had no intention of harming anyone." Miss Marple was studying the architectural plans again. "Mr. Crane, you said you researched Sir Mortimer before coming here. Did your research include these mechanical innovations?" "Some of it. I'm an engineer by training. I was fascinated by his work." "Fascinated enough to want to preserve it? To prevent it from being sold off piecemeal?" Crane's jaw tightened. "Charles wanted to gut the house, sell everything to the highest bidder. He saw it as a collection of valuable antiques, not as an integrated masterpiece of Victorian engineering." "So you argued with him about it?" "We discussed it, yes." "At 2 o'clock in the morning?" For the first time, Crane hesitated. We encountered each other on the stairs. Charles was agitated about something. He said he'd found proof that would let him override the other inheritances, that he could sell everything regardless of what the rest of us wanted. And you couldn't let that happen." "Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted quietly, "I think we should examine the other portraits. If one concealed a safe, others might as well." Her suggestion proved prescient. Behind a portrait of Sir Mortimer himself, they found another hidden compartment containing a document that changed everything. A codicil to the will signed and witnessed that would indeed have given Charles complete control over the house and its contents. "This is what he found," Miss Marple said, studying the document. "This is what he was so excited about, but the question remains, who else knew about it?" As if in answer to her question, they heard footsteps on the spiral staircase above them, the distinctive pattern they had all learned to recognize. Someone was climbing to the 13th step and stopping. But this time, they could see all the suspects. Everyone was accounted for in the library. "Then who," Inspector Hartwell asked grimly, "is on the 13th staircase?" The footsteps stopped, and in the silence that followed, they heard something that made everyone's blood run cold. The sound of the sealed door slowly creaking open. Chapter 7. The Servant's Hidden Passage. The sound of the sealed door opening sent a chill through the library that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Inspector Hartwell immediately took charge, positioning Sergeant Mills at the library entrance while he led a cautious expedition toward the 13th staircase. "Everyone stays together," he commanded. "No one wanders off alone." As they made their way through the confusing passages, Miss Marple noticed that Stevens the butler seemed unusually agitated. His normally composed demeanour had cracked, and his hands trembled slightly as he led them through the maze of corridors. "Stevens," she said quietly, "you know something about that staircase, don't you?" The butler's cadaverous face grew even paler. "It's not my place to say, madam." "A man is dead, Stevens. This is hardly the time for discretion." When they reached the location of the sealed door, they found it standing slightly ajar, just wide enough for a person to slip through. The paint around the edges was cracked and peeling, as if the door had been forced from the inside. "Impossible," Lady Beatrice whispered. "That door has been sealed for 30 years. Inspector Hartwell drew his torch and peered through the gap. "There's definitely a staircase here, and it looks like someone's been using it recently. The dust has been disturbed." "Inspector," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "before we explore further, perhaps Stevens should tell us what he knows about the servant passages in this house." All eyes turned to the butler, who seemed to shrink under their collective gaze. There are passages, yes. Sir Mortimer designed them so the staff could move about the house without disturbing the family. And these passages connect to the 13th staircase." Stevens nodded reluctantly. "There's a hidden entrance halfway up. It was how we accessed the staircase for cleaning before the incident." "The incident where Cornelius Thornfield died?" "Yes, madam. I was just a footman then, but I remember. Mr. Cornelius was found at the bottom of the 13th staircase, his neck broken. Sir Mortimer was convinced he'd been pushed, but no one could explain how the murderer had escaped. The staircase only had one entrance, you see." "But there was a second entrance," Miss Marple said, "through the servant passages." "Yes, madam, Sir Mortimer had it. Sir, sealed immediately after the funeral. He said the staircase was cursed." James Crane stepped forward. "Stevens, who else knows about these passages?" "All the senior staff, sir, and—" he hesitated. "Anyone who studied the original house plans would know." The implication hung heavy in the air. Charles Thornfield had been studying the plans. He would have known about the servant passages. "Show us," Inspector Hartwell commanded. Stevens led them to what appeared to be a blank wall in the servants' hall. He pressed a section of the wainscoting, and a panel swung inward, revealing a narrow passage barely wide enough for one person. "This connects to all the main staircases," Stevens explained, "including the 13th. Miss Marple examined the passage entrance carefully. "There are fresh scuff marks here on the floor. Someone has been using this passage recently." "But who?" Dr. Pemberton asked. "And why?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "we should ask who had access to the house plans, and who would benefit from Charles Thornfield's death." They entered the passage single file, Stevens leading with a lantern. The narrow corridor was dusty and filled with cobwebs, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed that a path had been cleared through the centre. Someone had indeed been using this route regularly. The passage branched and twisted, following the complex architecture of the house above. They passed openings that led to various staircases, each marked with small brass plaques indicating their destinations: main stair, tower stair, library spiral, and finally, stair 13. The entrance to the 13th staircase was different from the others, larger, more elaborate, with carved stonework that suggested it had once been the primary route to this part of the house. "This was the original grand staircase," Stevens explained. "Sir Mortimer had it sealed after his son's death and built the current main staircase to replace it." They emerged onto the 13th staircase itself, and Miss Marple immediately understood why it had acquired such a sinister reputation. Unlike the other staircases in the house, this one felt oppressive, claustrophobic. The walls were closer together, the ceiling lower, and the steps themselves were worn smooth by decades of use before the ceiling. "Count the steps," Miss Marple instructed. They climbed slowly, counting aloud. At the 13th step, they stopped. Here, the stair was stained with what looked like old blood, and the stone was chipped as if from a violent impact. "This is where Cornelius died," Stephen said quietly, "and where we heard the footsteps stopping each night." "But why would someone recreate those footsteps?" Cynthia Ashford asked. "What was the point?" Miss Marple was examining the walls around the 13th step. "Mr. Crane, you said you're an engineer. Look at this stonework. Does anything strike you as unusual?" Crane studied the wall carefully, running his hands over the carved stone. "Yes, actually. This section is different from the rest. The stone is the same, but the mortar is newer. As if something had been removed and then replaced." "Exactly." Inspector Hartwell joined the examination. "Stevens, was anything taken from this staircase after Cornelius's death?" I believe Sir Mortimer removed some items, yes. Personal effects of his son." "What sort of personal effects?" Stevens looked increasingly uncomfortable. "I was only a footman, sir. But I heard the other servants talking. They said Mr. Cornelius had hidden something valuable on this staircase. Something his father didn't want found." "Hidden where?" "Behind the 13th step, sir. There was supposed to be a secret compartment." Miss Marple and Inspector Hartwell exchanged glances. "And you think Sir Mortimer found this compartment and sealed it up?" "I think he found it, sir, but I don't think he found what was in it. The servant said Mr. Cornelius was too clever for his father. Whatever he hid it well. And someone has been looking for it," Miss Marple concluded. "Someone who knew the family history, who had access to the house plans, and who could move through the servant passages without being detected." "Charles," Lady Beatrice said suddenly. "Charles knew all of the family stories. He was obsessed with finding Cornelius's treasure." "But Charles is dead," Dr. Pemberton pointed out. "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Which suggests that either he found what he was looking for, and someone killed him for it, or someone else found it first, and killed him to keep the secret." As if summoned by her words, they heard footsteps in the passage below. Someone was climbing toward them through the servants' route. "Everyone stay calm," Inspector Hartwell whispered, drawing his torch like a weapon. The footsteps grew closer, and then a figure emerged from the passage entrance. Mrs. Weatherby looking flustered and carrying a small oil lamp. "Oh," she gasped, seeing them all. "I was looking for— that is, I heard voices and thought—" "Mrs. Weatherby," Miss Marple said gently, "how did you know about the servant passages?" The plump woman's face crumpled. I used to work here. Years ago, before I married Mr. Weatherby, I was a housemaid." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Miss Marple smiled sadly. "And you knew about Cornelius's secret, didn't you? You've been coming back, searching for it all these years." Mrs. Weatherby began to cry. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Charles wasn't supposed to die. I just wanted what was rightfully mine." "What was rightfully yours?" "The letters," she sobbed. "Cornelius wrote me letters, love letters. He promised to marry me, but his father forbade it. He hid the letters on this staircase, said they proved his intentions, said if anything happened to him, I should find them and claim my rights as his intended bride. And you've been searching for them ever since? For 30 years. But Charles found them first. He said they were worthless, just old love letters. He was going to burn them. Inspector Hartwell stepped forward. So you killed him? No, Mrs. Weatherby cried. I couldn't. But Miss Marple was studying the woman's face, and she saw something there that made her heart sink. Fear, yes, and grief, but also the desperate cunning of someone who had spent 30 years nursing a secret obsession. Mrs. Weatherby, she said quietly, I think you'd better tell us exactly what happened on the night Charles died. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Tower. Mrs. Weatherby's confession came in broken sobs as they stood on the 13th step, where so much tragedy had unfolded. But as her story emerged, Miss Marple realized that the truth was more complex than a simple case of murder for love letters. I did meet Charles that night, Mrs. Weatherby admitted, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. But not on the main staircase. It was here, on the 13th staircase. He'd found the letters behind the loose stone. The same stone where poor Cornelius hid them 30 years ago. What time was this? Inspector Hartwell asked. Just after midnight. I'd been waiting in the servant passage, listening for him. I knew he'd been searching, you see. I'd been watching him for days. And what happened when you met? He laughed at me, she said bitterly. Called me a foolish old woman living in the past. He said the letters proved nothing, that Cornelius had been a young man amusing himself with a servant girl. He threatened to show them to everyone to humiliate me. So you struck him? No, I would never. I couldn't hurt anyone. I just pleaded with him to give me the letters. They were all I had left of Cornelius. Miss Marple was studying the acoustics of the staircase, noting how sounds seemed to carry and echo in peculiar ways. Mrs. Weatherby, when you were pleading with Charles, did you raise your voice? Yes, I suppose I did. I was desperate. And Charles, was he angry? Furious? He shouted at me, told me to stop living in a fantasy. His voice echoed terribly in this narrow space. What happened next? Someone else came. We heard footsteps in the passage below, and Charles panicked. He said if anyone found us together, it would ruin everything. He pushed past me and ran up the stairs. Up the stairs? But his body was found at the bottom of the main staircase. I know. That's what I don't understand. He went up, toward the tower. I heard his footsteps climbing higher and higher. Inspector Hartwell frowned. The 13th staircase connects to the tower. Stevens nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir. It was the original route to the North Tower. Sir Mortimer sealed that connection too, but someone could have reopened it, Miss Marple finished, just as they reopened the door below. They climbed past the 13th step, following the staircase as it curved upward. At the top, they found another sealed door, but this one showed clear signs of recent tampering. The wood around the lock was splintered, and the door stood slightly ajar. Beyond the door lay the tower staircase, the external spiral that wound around the outside of the building. From here, they could see the entire grounds of Thornfield Manor spread below them, and more importantly, they could see how the tower connected to other parts of the house. Remarkable, Dr. Pemberton breathed. From here, you could access almost any part of the building. Miss Marple was examining the tower staircase with particular interest. The stone steps were worn smooth by weather and age, but she noticed something that made her pause. Inspector, look at this! On one of the steps, about halfway down the external spiral, was a dark stain that looked suspiciously like blood. And caught on the rough stone of the tower wall was another thread. the same unusual gold-green colour they'd found on the main staircase banister. "Charles was here," Inspector Hartwell said grimly, "but how did he end up at the bottom of the main staircase?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "we should examine where this tower staircase leads." They descended the external spiral carefully, noting how the wind and rain had made the steps treacherous. At the bottom, they found themselves in a small courtyard that connected to several parts of the house, including a door that led directly to the main entrance hall. So Charles could have come down the tower, entered through this door, and then— Inspector Hartwell paused. But why would he go to the main staircase? Unless he was meeting someone else, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Someone who had arranged to meet him there. They returned to the house through the courtyard door, emerging into the entrance hall where Charles's body had been found. From this angle, Miss Marple could see something she'd missed before. The acoustic properties of the space were extraordinary. Sounds from the tower, from the various staircases, even from the upper floors, all seemed to converge here. This is the heart of Sir Mortimer's acoustic system, she realized. From here, you could hear conversations taking place anywhere in the house. James Crane, who had been unusually quiet during their exploration, suddenly spoke up. "That's how they did it." "How who did what?" Inspector Hartwell demanded. "Whoever killed Charles. They used the acoustic system to lure him to the main staircase. Think about it. If you knew how sounds carried in this house, you could make someone believe you were in one place when you were actually in another." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "The footsteps we all heard at different times from different staircases, they weren't random. They were a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to confuse us about who was where and when. But who would know the acoustic system well enough to manipulate it like that?" Before anyone could answer, they heard a sound that made them all freeze. Footsteps on the main staircase above them, descending slowly and deliberately. But they could see the staircase clearly, and there was no one there. "The echo," Dr. Pemberton whispered. "It's an echo from somewhere else in the house." Miss Marple tilted her head, listening carefully. "No," she said quietly, "not an echo. Someone is walking on one of the other staircases, and the sound is being channeled here through the acoustic system." "But which staircase?" The footsteps stopped, and in the silence that followed, they heard something else. A voice, faint but audible, coming from somewhere above them. "Should have left well enough alone. Too dangerous now. Have to finish what we started." The voice was distorted by the acoustic system, making it impossible to identify the speaker or determine their location. But the words were clear enough, and their meaning was unmistakable. "Someone else is in danger," Miss Marple said urgently. "Inspector, we need to find the source of that voice immediately." But as they spread out to search the various staircases, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into a trap. The killer had used the house's acoustic properties once to commit murder. Now they were using them again. But this time, Miss Marple suspected, the intended victims were the investigators themselves. The house with 13 staircases was revealing its secrets, but each revelation seemed to lead deeper into a maze of deception and danger. And somewhere in that maze, a killer was waiting, ready to strike again. Chapter 9. The Broken Banister. The search for the source of the mysterious voice proved futile. By the time they had organized themselves to check each staircase, the speaker had vanished, leaving only the echo of their ominous words hanging in the air. Inspector Hartwell was growing increasingly frustrated with the house's labyrinthine nature. "It's like chasing ghosts," he muttered as they regrouped in the entrance hall. "Every time we think we've pinpointed something, it disappears." Miss Marple was studying the architectural plans they'd found earlier, tracing the acoustic channels with her finger. "Inspector, I believe we're approaching this backwards. Instead of chasing sounds, perhaps we should be asking ourselves, who benefits from Charles Thornfield's death?" "Well, his inheritance would be redistributed," Inspector Hartwell said. "Lady Beatrice would get a larger share, and Mr. Crane here would inherit more as well." "But there's something else," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "The codicil we found, the one that would have given Charles complete control. If that document were to disappear—" She was interrupted by a scream from somewhere above them. This time there was no mistaking the direction. It came from the gallery that overlooked the main staircase. They rushed up the curved marble steps, taking them two at a time. On the gallery, they found Cynthia Ashford pressed against the wall, her face white with terror, staring at a section of the ornate iron banister. "It moved!" she gasped. "I was just leaning against it, looking down at the hall, and it gave way. If I hadn't caught myself—" Inspector Hartwell examined the banister carefully. What he found made his expression grim. "This has been deliberately weakened. Look here, the bolts have been partially unscrewed, and this support beam has been sawed through." "When?" Dr. Pemberton asked, joining the examination. "Recently. The metal shavings are still bright, not oxidized. This was done within the last day or two." Miss Marple was studying the pattern of the damage. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone knew exactly which section of banister Miss Ashford would lean against. "How could they possibly know that?" Cynthia asked, still shaking. "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "you have a habit, my dear. I've noticed you always stand in the same spot when you're thinking or worried. Just there, where the gallery curves and you can see both the main staircase and the entrance to the east wing." It was true. Even now, despite her fright, Cynthia had unconsciously moved back toward that same position. "Someone has been watching you," Inspector Hartwell said grimly, "studying your habits, waiting for the right moment. But why would anyone want to hurt me?" Cynthia's voice was barely a whisper. "Perhaps," James Crane suggested, "because you know something you don't realize you know." Miss Marple nodded. "Mr. Crane is quite right. Miss Ashford, you mentioned that Charles told you he'd found something important. Did he give you any details?" "Not really. He was excited, almost manic. He said he'd discovered proof that would change everything, that he'd be able to override the other inheritances." "The codicil," Inspector Hartwell said. "But he also said something else," Cynthia continued, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Something about the house itself. He said Sir Mortimer was cleverer than anyone realized, that the real treasure wasn't hidden in the house, it was the house. What did he mean by that? I don't know. He was being deliberately mysterious. But he kept talking about patents and innovations, about how much collectors would pay for authentic Victorian mechanical devices." Miss Marple exchanged glances with Inspector Hartwell. "The acoustic system, the hidden passages, the mechanical locks, they're all part of an integrated system." "Worth a fortune to the right buyer," James Crane added, "but only if they could be properly documented and authenticated." "And only if the current owners agreed to sell, Doctor," Pemberton pointed out. "Exactly," Miss Marple said, "which brings us back to the inheritance. With Charles dead and the codicil missing, the ownership reverts to the original will, divided between Lady Beatrice, Mr. Crane, and—" She paused, looking at Cynthia. "My dear, I don't suppose your father mentioned any family connection to the Thornfields? Cynthia looked puzzled. Father? No, he's not related to them at all. We're here because... She stopped, her face growing pale. Because why, Miss Ashford? Because father has been negotiating to buy the house. He represents a consortium of investors interested in Victorian architecture. But that was supposed to be confidential. The revelation hit the group like a thunderbolt. Mr. Ashford, the stern military man, was not just a guest, he was a potential buyer with a significant financial interest in acquiring Thornfield Manor. "Where is your father now?" Inspector Hartwell asked urgently. I don't know. I haven't seen him since breakfast." They spread out to search for Mr. Ashford, but Miss Marple lingered on the gallery, studying the damaged banister. Something about the pattern of sabotage bothered her. It was too obvious, too crude compared to the sophisticated murder of Charles Thornfield. "Inspector," she called as he started down the main staircase, "I think we should be very careful. This attempt on Miss Ashford's life feels different from Charles's murder." "Different how?" "Charles's death was carefully planned, using the house's own features against him. This feels more like panic, like someone making desperate moves." "You think the killer is losing control?" "I think the killer is being forced to improvise, and that makes them more dangerous." As if to prove her point, they heard a crash from somewhere in the house, followed by the sound of running footsteps. But this time, the footsteps were real, not echoes. They could hear them clearly moving from the east wing toward the main hall. "Someone's trying to escape," Inspector Hartwell shouted, racing down the stairs. But as they reached the entrance hall, they found Mr. Ashford stumbling through the door from the courtyard, his clothes torn and his face bleeding from several cuts. "The tower!" he gasped. "Someone pushed me down the tower stairs, tried to kill me." "Who?" Inspector Hartwell demanded. "I don't know. I was examining the external staircase, checking the structural integrity for my clients, when someone came up behind me. I managed to break my fall, but they got away." Miss Marple was studying Mr. Ashford's injuries. "These cuts are from the rough stone of the tower wall. You're lucky you weren't killed." "But why would anyone attack father?" Cynthia asked, rushing to help him. "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "someone doesn't want the house sold to outside investors. Someone who has their own plans for Thornfield Manor and its valuable secrets." "Then we're all in danger," Dr. Pemberton said grimly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "I'm afraid we are. The killer has moved beyond careful planning into desperate action. And in a house with 13 staircases, there are far too many opportunities for accidents." As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of footsteps again. But this time, they seemed to come from all 13 staircases at once, a symphony of movement that surrounded them like a closing trap. The house itself had become a weapon, and somewhere in its vertical maze, a killer was preparing to strike again. Chapter 10. Shadows on the Garden Steps. The cacophony of footsteps from multiple staircases created an atmosphere of mounting terror. Inspector Hartwell immediately took charge, positioning everyone in the entrance hall where they could watch all the visible staircase entrances. "Nobody moves alone," he commanded. "We stay together until we can determine what's happening." But Miss Marple was studying the pattern of sounds with her usual keen attention. "Inspector, I don't think those footsteps are meant to frighten us. I think they're meant to mask something else." "What do you mean?" "Listen carefully. The rhythm is too regular, too mechanical, Someone is using the acoustic system to create the illusion of multiple people moving through the house. As if responding to her observation, the footsteps suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence. In that silence, they heard something else. The distant sound of a door closing, coming from the direction of the garden. "The garden steps," Stephen said suddenly. "There's another staircase outside. The stone steps that lead down through the terraced garden to the old chapel." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "That would make 14 staircases, wouldn't it?" "No, madam. Sir Mortimer never counted the garden steps as part of his 13. He said they belonged to God, not to architecture." "How convenient," Miss Marple murmured. "An uncounted staircase, the perfect escape route." Inspector Hartwell was already moving toward the garden doors. "Sergeant Mills, you stay here with the witnesses. Miss Marple, if you would accompany me." They stepped out into the grey afternoon, where a light drizzle had made the stone steps treacherous. The garden was laid out in elaborate terraces, connected by a winding stone staircase that descended through formal flower beds toward a small Gothic chapel at the bottom of the hill. "There," Miss Marple pointed. "Someone's moving down there." A figure in a dark coat was descending the garden steps rapidly, but carefully, clearly familiar with the treacherous footing. At this distance, it was impossible to identify who it was. "Should we pursue?" Inspector Hartwell asked. "I think not," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "I suspect we're meant to pursue. This feels like another diversion." Instead, she began examining the top of the garden steps, looking for clues. What she found was illuminating. Fresh mud on the stone, tracked from inside the house, and caught on a thorny rose bush. Another thread of that distinctive gold-green fabric. "Our killer has been here recently," she observed. "But look at this mud pattern. These aren't the footprints of someone fleeing. They're too deliberate, too careful." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking someone has been using the garden steps as a regular route in and out of the house. Someone who needed to move without being seen by the other guests." They followed the muddy trail, which led not down the garden steps, but around the side of the house, to a small door that Miss Marple hadn't noticed before. It was partially concealed by ivy, and appeared to lead directly into the lower level of the house. The old servants' entrance, Inspector Hartwell realized. It would connect to the kitchen and the servant passages. "And from there to any of the 13 staircases," Miss Marple added. "Inspector, I believe we've found how our killer has been moving through the house undetected." They tried the door and found it unlocked. Inside, a narrow corridor led past the modern kitchens toward the maze of servant passages they'd explored earlier. But Miss Marple paused at the threshold, studying the muddy footprints on the floor. 2 sets of prints, she observed, one going out, one coming in. But they're different sizes. 2 people, or 1 person making multiple trips, but why? Their question was answered when they heard voices from the kitchen. Lady Beatrice and Dr. Pemberton speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "Can't continue like this," Dr. Pemberton was saying. "Too many people are getting hurt." "But we're so close," Lady Beatrice replied. "Charles found the final piece. If we can just locate it." "At what cost? Another death, another accident." Miss Marple and Inspector Hartwell exchanged glances. Moving carefully, they positioned themselves where they could observe the kitchen without being seen. Lady Beatrice was pacing nervously while Dr. Pemberton sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Between them lay several documents that looked like architectural plans. "Beatrice, we have to stop this," Dr. Pemberton said firmly. "I agreed to help you search for Sir Mortimer's lost patents, but I never agreed to murder." "I didn't murder anyone," Lady Beatrice protested. "Charles's death was an accident. He fell during our argument." "An argument about what?" "About the patents, of course. He'd found Sir Mortimer's hidden workshop in the chapel. All the original prototypes, the working models, everything. Worth millions to collectors and museums. And he wouldn't share. He wanted to sell everything immediately, split the money with that dreadful Crane person. He didn't understand the historical significance, the need for proper preservation." Dr. Pemberton looked up at her with sad eyes. "So you followed him to the main staircase and pushed him?" "I didn't push him. We were arguing, yes, and I grabbed his arm to stop him from leaving. He pulled away violently and lost his balance. It was an accident, I swear it." "Then why didn't you call for help? Why create all this elaborate deception with the footsteps and the acoustic tricks?" Lady Beatrice's composure finally cracked completely. "Because I panicked. I knew how it would look, the video of the grieving aunt who stood to inherit more with Charles dead. And I couldn't let them find the workshop, not until I'd secured the patents properly." "So you've been using the servant passages to access the chapel, removing the prototypes piece by piece. Just the most valuable ones. The rest are still there." Miss Marple had heard enough. She stepped into the kitchen, Inspector Hartwell close behind her. "Lady Beatrice," she said gently, "I think you'd better show us this workshop." Both conspirators spun around, their faces draining of colour. Dr. Pemberton started to rise, but Inspector Hartwell's firm hand on his shoulder kept him seated. "It's over," the inspector said quietly. "We heard everything." Lady Beatrice seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Those patents, those inventions, they're Sir Mortimer's legacy. They belong in museums, not in some private collector's vault." "That may be true," Miss Marple said kindly, "but murder is not the way to preserve history. And I'm afraid, my dear, that Charles's death was not the accident you've convinced yourself it was." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when you grabbed his arm on the main staircase, you knew exactly how dangerous those marble steps were. You knew that a fall from that height would likely be fatal. In your heart, Lady Beatrice, you know you intended to kill him." The truth of Miss Marple's words hit Lady Beatrice like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. "The workshop," Inspector Hartwell said grimly. "Show us the workshop." As they prepared to descend the garden steps to the chapel, Miss Marple couldn't help but reflect on the tragedy of it all. A house built as a monument to architectural innovation had become a maze of deception and death, its 13 staircases serving not to elevate the human spirit, but to conceal the depths to which it could sink. The shadows on the garden steps seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be revealed, and Miss Marple suspected that the chapel at the bottom of the hill held the final pieces of this complex puzzle. Chapter 11. The Cellar's Crooked Descent. The chapel at the bottom of the garden steps proved to be far more than a simple place of worship. As Lady Beatrice led them through its heavy oak doors, Miss Marple immediately noticed that the building's proportions seemed wrong. It was too large for a private chapel, too deep, with shadows that suggested hidden spaces beyond the altar. "Sir Mortimer had it rebuilt when he constructed the manor," Lady Beatrice explained, her voice hollow with defeat. "He claimed it was for the spiritual welfare of his household, but really it was to house his workshop." Dr. Pemberton, walking beside Inspector Hartwell like a condemned man, added quietly, "The chapel was perfect cover. No one questions a man's devotion to God, even when that devotion involves strange noises and mysterious comings and goings." Behind the altar, Concealed by a tapestry depicting the Ascension of Christ was another door. This one was modern, fitted with an elaborate lock that looked distinctly out of place in the Gothic setting. Charles found the key in the same safe as the architectural plans, Lady Beatrice said, producing an ornate brass key from her pocket. Sir Mortimer hid it well, but Charles was always clever with puzzles. The door opened onto a staircase unlike any other in Thornfield Manor. Where the house's 13 staircases were grand or mysterious or functional, this one was purely utilitarian. Narrow stone steps descending into the earth beneath the chapel. But what made it remarkable was its construction. The steps were deliberately uneven, some higher, some lower, creating a crooked, almost drunken descent into darkness. "Why build it this way?" Inspector Hartwell asked, noting how the irregular steps made walking treacherous. "Security," Dr. Pemberton answered. "Anyone unfamiliar with the pattern would stumble, make noise. Sir Mortimer was paranoid about industrial espionage." Miss Marple was studying the staircase with fascination. "How many steps?" 13, Lady Beatrice said automatically, then caught herself. "Oh, I see what you're thinking. Yes, even here, he couldn't escape his obsession with that number." They descended carefully, each step requiring attention to avoid stumbling on the irregular heights. At the bottom, Lady Beatrice lit several oil lamps, revealing a sight that took everyone's breath away. Sir Mortimer's workshop was a Victorian inventor's dream made manifest. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with intricate mechanical devices in various stages of completion. Gears, springs, and clockwork mechanisms filled every available surface. But most impressive were the larger inventions: a mechanical lift system, a rotating bookcase, an elaborate pulley system that could move heavy objects through the house's passages. "Good heavens," Inspector Hartwell breathed. "This is extraordinary." "Worth a fortune," Dr. Pemberton added. "These aren't just curiosities, they're working prototypes of mechanical systems that wouldn't be perfected for decades. Sir Mortimer was 50 years ahead of his time." Miss Marple was examining a detailed drawing pinned to one of the workbenches. "This appears to be a plan for the acoustic system in the house. Look at these calculations. He designed it to carry specific frequencies while dampening others. He could eavesdrop on any conversation in the house from this workshop," Lady Beatrice explained. "There's a listening post over there, connected to acoustic tubes that run throughout the building." Indeed, in one corner of the workshop stood an elaborate chair surrounded by speaking tubes, each labelled with a different room or staircase. It was like a primitive telephone exchange, allowing someone to monitor the entire house from this underground lair. "Charles discovered this 3 days ago," Lady Beatrice continued. "He was ecstatic, not about the historical significance, but about the money. He said he could sell the individual pieces to collectors for millions." "And you couldn't allow that," Miss Marple said gently. "These inventions should be preserved as a collection, studied by scholars, displayed in museums. Charles wanted to break them up, sell them to the highest bidder. It would have been vandalism." Inspector Hartwell was examining another section of the workshop, where several items were conspicuously missing: empty spaces on workbenches, gaps in the organized displays. "You've been removing pieces," he observed. "Only the most portable items," Dr. Pemberton admitted. "We were going to donate them to the Science Museum in London, ensure they were properly preserved. Without the consent of the legal owners. We were going to replace them with detailed replicas," Lady Beatrice said defensively. "No one would have known the difference." Miss Marple was studying the listening post with particular interest. "Lady Beatrice, on the night Charles died, were you down here?" "Yes. I often came here in the evenings to study Sir Mortimer's notes. It was peaceful, away from the guests. And you could hear what was happening in the house. Everything. The acoustic system carries sound both ways. I could hear conversations, footsteps, even whispers. So you heard Charles moving through the house that night? Lady Beatrice nodded reluctantly. He was agitated, moving from room to room. I heard him arguing with that Weatherby woman on the 13th staircase. Then later, I heard him in the tower. What was he doing in the tower? I think he was trying to signal someone outside. There were flashes of light. He must have been using a torch or lantern. Signalling whom? I don't know, but I heard a car on the road below, stopping and starting several times. Inspector Hartwell frowned. You think Charles was meeting someone? It's possible. He'd been making mysterious telephone calls all week, speaking in hushed tones about finalizing arrangements and completing the transaction. Miss Marple was piecing together the timeline in her mind. So Charles argued with Mrs. Weatherby at midnight, went to the tower to signal someone, then came down to the main staircase, where he encountered you. Yes. He was carrying a satchel full of the smaller inventions, the most valuable pieces. He said he was leaving immediately, that he'd found a buyer who would pay cash for the entire collection. And you tried to stop him. I begged him to reconsider. These inventions are irreplaceable. Once they're scattered to private collectors, they'll be lost to history forever. But he refused to listen. Lady Beatrice's voice broke. He laughed at me, called me a sentimental old fool, said history was for people who couldn't afford to live in the present. So you grabbed his arm. I just wanted to stop him from leaving with those precious artifacts, but he jerked away so violently, and the marble steps were slippery from the rain that had blown in through the open door. Miss Marple studied Lady Beatrice's face carefully. My dear, I think you're still not telling us the complete truth. What do you mean? I mean that Charles's fall was not as accidental as you've described. You knew those steps were dangerous. You knew that a violent struggle at the top of a marble staircase could only end one way. Lady Beatrice's composure finally shattered completely. He was going to destroy everything, she cried. 50 years of genius, reduced to trinkets for rich collectors. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't. So you deliberately caused him to fall? I pushed him. God help me, I pushed him, but I never meant for him to die. I just wanted him to drop the satchel, to give me time to reason with him. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. Inspector Hartwell stepped forward to formally arrest Lady Beatrice, but Miss Marple held up a hand. Inspector, I think there's still more to this story. Lady Beatrice, who was Charles meeting? Who was waiting in that car? I don't know, I swear I don't know. But Miss Marple was studying the workshop again, noting details she'd missed before. Dr. Pemberton, you've been very quiet. Don't you have anything to add to Lady Beatrice's confession? The doctor's face had gone pale. What do you mean? I mean that you were the one in the car, weren't you? You were Charles's buyer. The truth hit the room like a thunderbolt, and Miss Marple knew that the seller's crooked descent had led them not just to Sir Mortimer's workshop, but to the heart of a conspiracy that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. Chapter 12. Gathering on the gallery stairs. Dr. Pemberton's face crumpled under Miss Marple's steady gaze, and the truth came spilling out like water through a broken dam. You don't understand, he said desperately. I was trying to save the collection, not destroy it. By buying it from Charles? Inspector Hartwell demanded. By outbidding the real buyers. Charles had been in contact with a consortium of private collectors, people who would have scattered the inventions across the globe. I was representing the British Museum, trying to keep the collection intact." Miss Marple studied his face carefully. "But something went wrong with your plan." "Charles got greedy. At the last minute, he doubled his asking price. Said he'd found additional items that made the collection even more valuable." "The codicil to the will?" "No, something else. He claimed he'd discovered Sir Mortimer's greatest invention, something that would revolutionize modern engineering." Lady Beatrice looked up sharply. "That's impossible. I've catalogued everything in this workshop." "Not everything," Dr. Pemberton said quietly. "Charles found Sir Mortimer's private journal. It describes a final invention, something he called the perpetual stair." "What on earth is that?" Inspector Hartwell asked. "A mechanical staircase that could reconfigure itself, change its height, direction, even its location within a building. Sir Mortimer believed it was the future of architecture." Miss Marple was studying the workshop with renewed interest. "And where is this perpetual stair?" "That's just it. No one knows. The journal describes it, but doesn't reveal its location. Charles was convinced it was hidden somewhere in Thornfield Manor." "So you were waiting in the car while Charles searched for it?" "Yes. We'd arranged to meet at 3:00. When he didn't appear, I assumed he'd found something and needed more time. I waited until dawn, then left, without checking on him." Dr. Pemberton's voice was barely a whisper. "I was afraid. If Charles had been caught stealing from the house, my reputation would have been ruined. The museum would never have forgiven the scandal." Inspector Hartwell was taking notes furiously. "So you knew nothing about his death until the next morning?" "Nothing. I was as shocked as anyone when his body was discovered." Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information. Then she looked up with the expression that those who knew her had learned to recognize. The look of someone who had just seen the final piece of a complex puzzle fall into place. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I think it's time we gathered everyone together. I believe I know what really happened to Charles Thornfield, and why. Here, in the workshop. Number upstairs, on the gallery overlooking the main staircase. It's the only place in the house where all 13 staircases are visible, and where the truth can finally be revealed." They climbed the crooked cellar stairs for the last time, leaving Sir Mortimer's workshop to its shadows and secrets. Back in the house, Inspector Hartwell assembled all the remaining guests and staff on the gallery, where Cynthia Ashford had nearly fallen to her death. The group was smaller now. Mrs. Weatherby sat quietly in a chair, her face streaked with tears. James Crane stood by the damaged banister, his expression unreadable. Mr. Ashford, his cuts bandaged, looked grim and suspicious. Stevens the butler maintained his usual sepulchral composure, while Cynthia clung to her father's arm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, "we are gathered here on the gallery stairs, the 14th staircase, if you will, to discuss the death of Charles Thornfield and the secrets of this remarkable house." She paused, looking around at the assembled faces. "This case has been complicated by the unique nature of Thornfield Manor, its 13 staircases, its acoustic properties, its hidden passages. But at its heart, it's a simple story of greed, obsession, and the lengths people will go to protect what they believe is rightfully theirs. Lady Beatrice has confessed to pushing Charles down the main staircase," Inspector Hartwell said. "Surely that's the end of it?" "I'm afraid not, Inspector. Lady Beatrice did indeed push Charles, but Charles was already dead when she pushed him." A gasp went around the group. Lady Beatrice looked up in shock. "What do you mean?" "I mean, my dear, that you pushed a corpse down those stairs. Charles Thornfield was murdered earlier that night. and his body was positioned at the top of the main staircase to make his death look like an accident. "But that's impossible," Dr. Pemberton protested. "I saw him alive at 2 o'clock when he was signalling from the tower." "No, Doctor. You saw someone signalling from the tower, but it wasn't Charles." Miss Marple moved to the centre of the gallery, where she could see all the staircases radiating out from the entrance hall below. "The key to this mystery lies in understanding Sir Mortimer's greatest invention, not the perpetual stair, which I suspect exists only in his imagination, but the house itself." "What do you mean?" James Crane asked. "I mean that Thornfield Manor is not just a house with 13 staircases. It's a giant machine, designed to manipulate sound, movement and perception. Sir Mortimer built it as the ultimate stage for deception." She gestured to the various staircases visible from their vantage point. "From here, you can see how the staircases connect, how they create sight lines and acoustic channels. Someone who understood this system could create the illusion of being in multiple places at once. But who would know the system well enough to manipulate it like that?" Inspector Hartwell asked. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Stevens the butler. "Someone who had lived in this house for decades. Someone who knew every secret passage, every acoustic trick, every hidden mechanism." Stevens's composure finally cracked. "I don't know what you're implying, madam." "I'm not implying anything, Stevens. I'm stating it directly. You killed Charles Thornfield." The accusation hung in the air like a sword. Stevens stood perfectly still, his cadaverous face showing no emotion. "You've served this family for 40 years, Miss Marple continued. "You've watched them treat Sir Mortimer's legacy as a collection of curiosities to be sold to the highest bidder. When Charles decided to strip the house of its treasures, you couldn't bear it." The young master had no appreciation for his great-grandfather's genius, Stevens said quietly. He saw only money where he should have seen wonder. "So you killed him?" "I defended the house, as I have always done." "How?" Inspector Hartwell demanded. Stevens looked around the gallery, his eyes taking in the staircases that had been his domain for so many years. "The house told me how," he said simply. "It showed me the way." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "You used the acoustic system to lure Charles to the tower, then struck him down with one of Sir Mortimer's mechanical devices. You positioned his body at the top of the main staircase, knowing that Lady Beatrice would find him there, and in her panic would push him down the stairs. Creating the perfect cover for murder, Inspector Hartwell realized. Lady Beatrice would confess to an accidental killing, never realizing she was covering up a deliberate one." "But how did you know Lady Beatrice would be there?" Dr. Pemberton asked. "Because Stevens had been listening to all of us through the acoustic system," Miss Marple explained. "He knew about the planned meeting with Dr. Pemberton. He knew Lady Beatrice would try to stop Charles from leaving with the artifacts. He orchestrated the entire scenario." Stevens smiled for the first time since Miss Marple had known him. A cold, satisfied expression. The house protected itself, as Sir Mortimer always intended. The 13 staircases were never just architecture. They were a defense system, designed to confuse and misdirect those who would harm the family legacy. "And now?" Inspector Hartwell asked, moving to arrest the butler. "Now the house is safe," Stevens said simply. "The secrets will remain secret, as they should." As Inspector Hartwell led Stevens away, Miss Marple remained on the gallery, looking down at the entrance hall where Charles Thornfield had died. The 13 staircases of Thornfield Manor had indeed told their story, a tale of obsession, loyalty, and the dangerous power of architectural genius. but she couldn't shake the feeling that even now, with the murderer caught and the mystery solved, the house was keeping one final secret. Somewhere in its vertical maze, Sir Mortimer's greatest invention might still be waiting to be discovered. The perpetual stair, perhaps, was not a mechanical device at all, but the endless cycle of human ambition and betrayal that the house seemed to inspire in all who dwelt within its walls. Chapter 13. The Truth of the 13th Staircase. As Inspector Hartwell led Stevens away in handcuffs, Miss Marple remained on the gallery, her keen eyes studying the entrance hall below. Something still troubled her about the case, a nagging sense that while they had caught the murderer, they had not yet uncovered the complete truth. "Miss Marple," James Crane approached her cautiously, "is it really over?" "The murder case is solved, Mr. Crane, but I suspect Thornfield Manor has one more secret to reveal." Lady Beatrice, still shaken by the revelation that she had unknowingly helped cover up a murder, joined them at the gallery rail. "What do you mean?" Stevens confessed. "Charles is dead. What more could there be?" "The 13th staircase," Miss Marple said simply. "We've explored 12 staircases in this house, plus the garden steps and this gallery. But the sealed staircase, the one where Cornelius died 30 years ago, we've only seen the bottom portion." "But it's been sealed since 1895, Dr. Pemberton protested. "Stevens said so himself." "Stevens said many things," Miss Marple replied. "But I've been thinking about his confession. He claimed the house told him how to commit the Sherwood murder, that it showed him the way. What if he meant that literally?" Inspector Hartwell, having handed Stevens over to Sergeant Mills, returned to the group. "What are you thinking, Miss Marple?" "I'm thinking we need to open the 13th staircase completely. Not just the door at the bottom, but whatever lies at the top." "But why? What could be up there after 30 years? "Perhaps," Miss Marple said quietly, "the answer to why Sir Mortimer really built this house." The expedition to fully explore the 13th staircase required tools to break through the sealed upper entrance. They climbed the narrow, oppressive stairs past the 13th step, where Cornelius had died, continuing upward until they reached what appeared to be a solid wall. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed something the others had missed. The wall was not quite solid. There were hairline cracks around the edges. And when James Crane pressed against it with his engineer's knowledge, a section swung inward on hidden hinges. "A secret door," he breathed, disguised to look like a sealed wall. Beyond the door lay a room that took everyone's breath away. It was Sir Mortimer's true masterpiece, not a workshop, but a control room. The walls were lined with mechanical devices, levers and gauges. In the centre stood an elaborate chair surrounded by speaking tubes, similar to the one in the cellar workshop but far more sophisticated. "Good heavens," Dr. Pemberton whispered. "It's like the bridge of a ship." Miss Marple was studying the various controls with fascination. "Not a ship, Doctor. A house. This is the command centre for Thornfield Manor." Indeed, as they examined the devices more closely, they could see that each control was labelled with a different part of the house. Levers marked main stair, tower stair, library spiral, gauges showing acoustic level, mechanical tension, structural integrity. Sir Mortimer didn't just build a house with 13 staircases, James Crane realised. He built a house where the staircases could be controlled, manipulated, even moved. Lady Beatrice was staring at a large diagram on the wall, a cross-section of Thornfield Manor showing not just the visible staircases, but a complex network of mechanical systems running throughout the building. "The perpetual stair," she whispered. "It wasn't a single staircase that could move. It was all of them. The entire house is one giant mechanical device. Miss Marple was examining a leather-bound logbook that lay open on a desk beside the control chair. "Listen to this," she said, reading from Sir Mortimer's spidery handwriting. "Day 1247 of the Great Work. The house responds perfectly to my commands. I can raise or lower any staircase, redirect the acoustic channels, even seal off entire sections. Thornfield Manor is no longer merely a dwelling. It is a living entity, responsive to my will." "He was mad," Dr. Pemberton said flatly. Perhaps he was a genius ahead of his time." Miss Marple continued reading. "Cornelius grows suspicious of my work. He has been asking questions about the strange noises at night, the way rooms seem to change when he's not looking. I fear he may discover the control room. If he does, I may have to take drastic action to protect the great work." The implication was clear. Inspector Hartwell frowned. "Are you suggesting Sir Mortimer killed his own son?" "I'm suggesting that Cornelius's death was not the random murder it appeared to be. Look at this entry, dated the day before Cornelius died. He knows. He followed me to the 13th stair tonight and saw me enter the control room. He threatens to expose everything, to have me committed to an asylum. I cannot allow the great work to be destroyed. The house must be protected, whatever the cost." So Sir Mortimer murdered Cornelius to protect his secret, and then sealed the staircase to prevent anyone else from discovering the control room. But he made one mistake. He didn't account for the loyalty of his servants. "Stevens," Lady Beatrice breathed. "Stevens knew about this room." "Stevens has been the guardian of Sir Mortimer's secret for 40 years, Miss Marple confirmed. He's been using this control room to manipulate the house, creating the mysterious sounds, the moving objects, the acoustic tricks that have frightened guests for decades. But why kill Charles now? Why not just continue the deception?" Miss Marple was studying another section of the logbook, pages that appeared to have been written much more recently. "Because Charles was getting too close to the truth. Look at this. Stevens has been keeping his own log. Master Charles found the workshop today. He grows more suspicious. Soon he will discover the control room, and then all will be lost. The house whispers to me in the night, tells me what must be done. The great work must be preserved." Stevens really believed the house was talking to him. 40 years of isolation, of keeping such a momentous secret, of believing himself the guardian of architectural genius. Yes, I think Stevens genuinely believed the house was a living entity that communicated with him. Inspector Hartwell was examining the control mechanisms. Could these devices actually work after all these years? James Crane was studying the mechanical systems with professional interest. They're incredibly sophisticated, steam-powered, with a network of hydraulics and pulleys, if properly maintained. He pulled one of the levers experimentally. Immediately, they heard a grinding sound from somewhere in the house, followed by a series of mechanical clicks and whirs. "Good God!" Dr. Pemberton exclaimed. "You've activated something." They rushed to the windows of the control room, which offered a view of the main entrance hall below. What they saw was impossible, yet undeniably real. The main staircase was slowly rotating, its marble steps turning like the hands of a giant clock. "The sure, perpetual stair," Lady Beatrice whispered. "It's real." Miss Marple was watching the mechanical ballet with a mixture of awe and sadness. Sir Mortimer's greatest achievement, a house that could literally reshape itself. No wonder he was willing to kill to protect it. And no wonder Stevens was willing to kill to preserve it, Inspector Hartwell added grimly. As they watched, the staircase completed its rotation and locked into a new position, now leading to a different part of the house entirely. The acoustic properties of the entrance hall had changed as well. Sounds that had been clear before were now muffled, while new echoes emerged from previously silent corners. "This explains everything," Miss Marple said. "The confusing testimonies about where sounds came from, the way people got lost in the house, the mysterious footsteps that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Stevens has been using this control room to manipulate the house's configuration, creating a constantly changing maze. But surely people would have noticed staircases moving. Not if the changes were made gradually, at night, when everyone was asleep. And not if Stevens was careful to restore the original configuration before morning. The human mind tends to rationalize small discrepancies. A staircase that seems slightly different, a room that feels changed. We tell ourselves we're imagining things." James Crane was still studying the control mechanisms. "There are settings here for configurations I can't even imagine. Look, defensive mode, isolation protocol, emergency lockdown. Sir Mortimer designed this house as a fortress that could protect itself." "And Stevens used it as a weapon," Miss Marple said sadly. "The very genius that Sir Mortimer created to preserve his legacy became the tool for murder." As they prepared to leave the control room, Miss Marple took one last look at Sir Mortimer's logbook. The final entry, written in Stevens's careful handwriting, read, "The house is safe now. The secret is preserved. Master Charles will trouble us no more. The great work continues." "Inspector," she said quietly, "I think you'll find that Stevens has been living in this control room for years, emerging only to perform his duties as butler. He's been the ghost in Thornfield Manor's machine, the consciousness that Sir Mortimer believed he had given to his creation. And now the house will have to learn to live without its guardian. The question is, what will become of Sir Mortimer's great work?" As they descended the 13th staircase for the final time, Miss Marple reflected on the strange case of Thornfield Manor. A house built as a monument to architectural genius had become a prison for its creator's descendants, a maze of mechanical marvels that had ultimately served only to conceal murder and madness. The 13 staircases had indeed told their story, a tale of ambition and obsession, of the fine line between genius and insanity, and of the terrible price that can be paid for keeping secrets too long. Behind them, the control room fell silent, its mechanical heart finally still after decades of hidden operation. The house with 13 staircases would continue to stand, but its days as a living, breathing entity were over. The great work, as Sir Mortimer had called it, was finished at last. Epilogue. 6 months later, Miss Marple received a letter from James Crane, now the sole surviving heir to Thornfield Manor. The house had been donated to the National Trust, its mechanical systems preserved as a unique example of Victorian engineering. Stevens had been committed to an asylum, where he spent his days drawing elaborate architectural plans and muttering about houses that could think and feel. The 13th staircase had been opened to the public, its control room displayed as Sir Mortimer's greatest achievement. Visitors came from around the world to see the house that could reshape itself, though the mechanical systems were kept inactive for safety reasons. "The house is peaceful now," James wrote. "No more mysterious footsteps, no more moving shadows. It's as if it's finally resting after decades of restless activity. I sometimes wonder if Sir Mortimer's spirit has found peace as well, knowing that his great work is preserved and appreciated rather than hidden and feared." Miss Marple folded the letter and returned to her knitting. satisfied that justice had been served and that the remarkable legacy of Thornfield Manor would be preserved for future generations. The case of the 13 staircases was closed, but its lessons about the dangers of obsession and the importance of truth would remain with her always. In St. Mary Mead, life continued its peaceful rhythm, and Miss Marple was content to let it do so. After all, there were always more mysteries to solve, more truths to uncover, and more human nature to understand. The click of her knitting needles was the only sound in the quiet cottage, a gentle counterpoint to the memories of mechanical marvels and architectural mysteries that would forever remain one of her most extraordinary cases.